Hi there. This is the fifth video about the theory of incomplete measurements, a new approach of physics unifying quantum mechanics and relativity. In earlier videos, we saw how this theory can be summarized in 5 key points. In the previous video, we showed how our knowledge is based on statistics, and introduced the notion of probavector to represent such information. We also explained how we can recover the traditional continuous variables as an approximation. We also had a very fast glimpse of what physical laws might look like in that context. In this video, we are going to elaborate on this idea. We will see how we can also replace equations, not just variables, using probavectors. In classical theories of physics, laws are relations between physical values, which are traditionally expressed as equations. For example, Newton's second law of motion, shown on screen, relates force, mass and acceleration. Physical values are represented as variables, which are supposed to be real numbers. From such an equation, we can plot curves and graphs, like the one on the screen. Such equation-defined laws are said to be analytical. As we saw in earlier videos, the theory of incomplete measurements uses a different formalism that focuses on physical measurements. Each measurement can give a finite number of results. Knowledge about an experiment is represented by a probavector, which is a vector of natural numbers counting the occurrences for each possible result. Probavectors can also be used to represent probabilistic predictions about future measurements. A key insight here is that one can build probavectors for combinations of simpler measurements. If a first measurement can give 2 results, and another one 3, then a probavector for all pairs of possible results needs 6 elements. As a general rule, one can build multidimensional probavector by combining any number of measurement. This is the most general representation of laws of physics in the theory of incomplete measurements. Where classical physics would represent a law with an equation connecting n variables, the theory of incomplete measurements would use a probavector with n dimensions. We have represented the probavector here as a collection of cubes, where the size of each cube indicates the number of measurements matching that particular combination of measurements. Computers are a very powerful tool to visualize probavectors. The reason is that a modern computer display is almost equivalent to a 2-dimensional probavector. By putting values in what is called the video memory, one can precisely control how much light is emitted by the associated pixel. In other words, computers let us define the probavectors for the photons emitted at the surface of the screen. In quantum mechanics terminology, we could say that they let us precisely control the shape of the wave function for the photons coming out of the screen. To be more precise, we can control 3 probavectors corresponding to the 3 primary colors, red, green and blue. On today's machines, the light intensity for each primary color is generally defined by an 8-bit quantity, meaning that there are only 256 distinct values for each of the 3 components. While 256 values make a very limited natural number, this remains in most cases a good enough approximation to fool the human eye. By plotting the result of equations on the screen, we can visualize 2-dimensional probavectors for simple analytical laws. A line, for example, can represent the trajectory of a photon in space. A circle can represent the motion of a point on a wheel. We will see in another video that there is a very efficient algorithm, devised by John Bresenham, to deal with such simple shapes. We can of course also visualize more complex movements, like the end of a double pendulum. As with simple measurements, accumulating data over time makes the probavector more precise. By plotting various positions of the end of the double pendulum, we end up with a good understanding of the probability distribution. Thanks to our brain's innate ability to reconstruct 3-dimensional objects from a 2-dimensional projection, we can also project a 3-dimensional probavector on a computer screen. This may require a bit of animation to help us understand what we are seeing. For example, a 3-dimensional representation of a Lorentz attractor is shown on screen, along with the corresponding differential equations. Physically, this corresponds to properties of a 2-dimensional fluid layer. These various illustrations show how we can, generally speaking, always convert equations into probavectors. The opposite is not true. There are physical observations that cannot easily be reduced to equations. Scientists are used to visualizing such data using what is known as a scatter plot. For example, This two-dimensional scatter plot shows the height and weight of about 25,000 American teenagers, based on measurements made by the University of California. The result is a two-dimensional probavector. It represents a physical law, in the sense that this allows us to make probabilistic predictions and computations about human populations, like the average height or the maximum weight. Another example is this three-dimensional plot of 15,000 stars from the Hipparcos stars database. To better visualize it, we change the projection over time, helping our brain reconstruct the three-dimensional object. This gives us a good idea of the distribution of stars and matter around our own solar system. Finally, this third example shows a picture of a flower. A digital camera produces two-dimensional probavectors corresponding to a very large number of photon sensors, several millions of them in modern cameras. The screen then reproduces this probavector faithfully, allowing us to see what the camera captured. This kind of information about physical measurements is easily represented by probavectors, but not by simple equations, although many image formats use equations to compress images. Images are routinely used to display probavectors collected from measurements that are not themselves based on light. For example, computer tomography, magnetic resonance imaging and three-dimensional echography use very different physical measurements to provide a three-dimensional view of the human body usable by doctors. Probavectors are not restricted to data visualization. They are often used to precisely control physical laws. For example, the fuel efficiency of our cars has increased dramatically in the past 4 decades, largely thanks to electronic engine control. Tiny computers under the hood of our cars precisely compute the amount of fuel to inject or the timing of the ignition, for every single turn of the engine. This process implements a physical law controlling the engine, and does so much more precisely than any mechanical carburetor or ignition coil ever could. The physical law is precisely tuned using computer representations of probavectors, and there are tools that can be used to adjust this tuning. The key takeaway here is that probavectors can represent more than analytical laws. They can also represent laws of physics that are not easily reduced to equations. Examples of such data-driven laws of physics are not hard to find. The theory of incomplete measurements makes them first-class citizen. Another piece of information that probavectors can convey better than equations is the domain of validity for a physical law. In the case of medical data, the interesting part of the probavector is what is measured inside the body. While measurements may have been made outside the body, they will not be part in the relevant medical information, and as such, will not be displayed by the software. In that sense, the relevant probavector is restricted to the shape of the human body. In imaging, the domain of validity is so important that modern computer hardware has a dedicated so-called alpha channel, which is used to indicate opacity of the picture at each point of a rectangular image. This is how computers can easily generate pixel-precise overlays such as your mouse cursor, but also more subtle transparency and smoothing effects. A probavector works a bit differently. Any element in a probavector which has a zero value indicates that no measurement gave this result. Conversely, any non-zero element indicates a count of measurements giving this result. So we can define the domain of validity of a probavector as the set of measurements where the probavector has a non-zero value. You can always add zeros for all other measurement values, without any change in the physics you describe. This is actually a major difference with traditional quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, the wave function often reaches zero only asymptotically. The continuous function is never exactly zero. Consequently, for any arbitrary measurement result, there may be a small, but not strictly zero chance of observing the result. This prompted a renowned physicist, Brian Greene, to write that the particle you observe has a non-zero chance of being in the Andromeda galaxy. By contrast, in the theory of incomplete measurements, you can only get a non-zero probavector value where there is a detector. If your detector is a camera sensor, the probavector value for a detection outside of the sensor is strictly zero. It does not mean that a photon cannot miss the sensor, it only means you won't be able to measure its position. As far as the domain of validity of measurements is concerned, the theory of incomplete measurements correctly models the system, whereas quantum mechanics replaces it with an idealized model and, as a result, makes physically unverified predictions for photons that cannot hit any sensor. We have a video dedicated to this topic. Probavectors are a much more general way to represent knowledge than equations or variables. They can represent arbitrary data, as in digital pictures or even random noise. An equation can be turned into a probavector, but the opposite is not true. Computers have made the use of numerical data familiar, and in many cases, the data they manipulate is a good approximation of a probavector with a limited range. We now have to explain how Einstein's idea about relativity need to be transposed in this context. This is the topic of the next video.